On May 29, 1913, the cultural elite of Paris set out with great expectations for the world premiere of Rite of Spring, a new ballet by composer Igor Stravinsky. They got more than they bargained for. The music was harsh, the dancers' movements and costumes strange. Within minutes, whistles started, then hisses, boos, and howls. A riot broke out in the box seats. The Rite of Spring became the most notorious ballet in history. Provocative and modern with a vengeance, it announced a chaotic new world. The uproar in the theater that night was a glimpse of the larger forces of change building across Europe, ready to explode the next summer with World War I. Between August 1914 and November 1918, 27 countries would declare war. Over 60 million men from around the world would fight, and over 8.5 million die. The war they fought would achieve none of its planners' goals. Instead, it would sow the seeds of hatred, destroy and create nations, and shape the world we know today. In the summer of 1914, none of Europe's leaders expected to start the most destructive war the world had yet known. But they did. And the question is, why? The years leading up to the war were known as the Belle Époque, the beautiful time. The last major European war had been decades earlier. As the 20th century began, peace and prosperity prevailed. Technology delighted and amazed. Railroads crisscrossed nations and empires. Assembly lines spewed out automobiles that filled the streets of expanding cities. Steel and glass buildings reached for the sky, while early airplanes sliced through it, and newly invented movie cameras captured the wonder of it all. But under the surface, Europe was filled with unrest.
There were strains and stresses almost in all of the European countries before 1914, deep and abiding sources of tension within each of these countries.
Governments, most of them still ruled by kings and queens, faced growing pressure for elections and accountability. Socialists, pacifists, feminists, all were pushing for change. One idea kept these reformers going: progress.
Progress included becoming more and more and more peaceful. People thought that they had progressed so far that they would not have a war for a very long time. And that was something that the man in the street thought. But those who were the elites in the military and in the political leadership of countries thought, how soon are we going to go to a major war?
By 1914, 5 European countries literally ruled most of the world: Britain, France, Russia, Germany, and the Empire of Austria-Hungary. Constantly competing for resources and colonies around the globe, these great powers had formed a web of agreements to handle conflicts. An 1839 treaty made Belgium neutral, not for Belgium's sake, but to keep the small, strategically located country off limits to any great power. That treaty would give Belgium an unexpected role in the final hours before war. By the early 1900s, the great powers had divided into 2 treaty-bound camps: the Triple Entente of Britain, France, and Russia, and the Triple Alliance of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. If one country were attacked, its allies would come to the rescue. The Triple Alliance brought together one of Europe's youngest dynasties, Germany, and its oldest, Austria-Hungary.
In Austria-Hungary, you had an anachronism, the sort of thing we don't have anymore. A dynastic state ruling over a dozen or 2 dozen nationalities. and with an immense amount of strife as one ethnic group struggled against another.
Loyalty to the elderly Emperor Franz Joseph was all that kept the increasingly shaky empire from splitting apart. Austria's ally, Germany, was the rude upstart on the continent, created in 1871. That year, the small German-speaking kingdom of Prussia crushed France, then rounded up its neighboring states to form a new nation. Germany's population exploded, and so did its economy. By 1911, Germany produced as much steel as England, France, and Russia combined. Its schools and universities were the finest, and its army was the largest and most efficient in the world. All this was the legacy of one man, Otto von Bismarck.
The great questions of the day will not be decided by speeches and the decisions of a parliamentary majority, but by iron and blood.
As Germany's first chancellor, Bismarck answered only to the emperor or Kaiser. Bismarck hammered the German state into an industrial and military giant. Then he set out to protect his new nation and created Europe's system of alliances. But a new Kaiser, Wilhelm II, was crowned in 1888. He dismissed Bismarck and announced, "The course remains the same, full speed ahead." With Kaiser Wilhelm in charge, nothing would be the same again. Wilhelm was a restless, high-strung bully, and he saw Europe as his playground.
He loved uniforms, he loved strutting around, he loved making grand, dramatic announcements. He made boastful, strong announcements of decisions, and then the next day would think about it and take them back.
Wilhelm's greatest impact on international relations was precisely in his role as a kind of symbol or embodiment of the country that he led. So that the combination of exuberance, of blustering provocation, was taken as a sign of Germany's intentions.
Grandson of Britain's Queen Victoria, Wilhelm was jealous of Britain's overseas empire and its navy, the most powerful in the world. He announced he'd build his own navy to match it.
All the long years of my reign, my colleagues, the monarchs of Europe, have paid no attention to what I have to say. Soon, they will be more respectful.
Wilhelm's threats began to alarm two potential allies, his own cousins, Russia's Tsar Nicholas II and Britain's King George V.
Increasingly, as German diplomacy, crude and ill thought out, threatened one country after another, Britain found itself, without wanting to, being driven by German diplomacy into the camp of France and Russia.
Together, Russia, France, and Britain formed the Triple Entente. Britain's goal was simple. It wanted to protect its markets, its vast colonies, and its grip on the world economy. Under Napoleon, France had conquered much of Europe, but in 1871, France not only lost a war, it had to give up territory to the newly unified Germany. France wanted revenge. Russia, the great power with the most land and largest population, had also lost face in battle to tiny Japan in 1905. Despite having an incompetent ruler, Tsar Nicholas II, Russia was slowly rebuilding its military with loans from its ally France. These were the players: Russia, France, and Britain on one side, Austria and Germany on the other. Over time, these great power rivals found that their alliances and their commitments to protect each other meant less security, not more.
You tried to keep up with the Joneses, so to speak. So if they had our ships, you had to have ships. If they had this kind of gun, you had to have this kind of gun.
A furious arms race began. The Germans' lightning victory over France in 1871 had convinced the rest of Europe to follow the German military model: overwhelming force. For the first time, governments required universal military service. Men were drafted, and after their 2- or 3-year term, joined the reserves. Russia and France soon had peacetime armies of over 1 million men, while Germany had over 2 million.
Each of those increments of troops suggested that the other powers were trying to catch them unawares, or trying to get a jump on them. And though you had the perception of, are we falling behind?
War colleges sprang up, making war a science, not an art. Officers began dreaming up elaborate war plans.
The great explosion of the size of these military bodies made planning for a war indispensable. It was no longer a question, when you had several million men under arms, of simply marching to the frontier and seeing what was going to happen. The side that arrived at the frontiers with the best armed, best prepared, best mobilized forces was going to win the next war.
The era of industrial warfare had arrived. Technology began to drive war plans. Railroads became the building blocks for future conflict. One German general commanded, "Build no more fortresses, build railways." Each escalation by one country sparked another to escalate. All of Europe was becoming an armed camp, a camp supplied by a growing arms industry. Manufacturers worked hand in hand with the military, producing huge stockpiles of massively destructive weapons. On the seas, Britain introduced the Dreadnought, a revolutionary battleship bristling with gun turrets, and other countries scrambled to follow suit. In Germany, industrialist Alfred Krupp produced Big Bertha, a mobile artillery gun that could fire a 1-ton shell 9 miles. But few in the military really understood how destructive these new weapons were. British generals claimed that cavalry horses could overwhelm enemy machine guns. The Russian Minister of War believed bayonets would protect his troops.
The French were probably the most egregious case, in which they simply thought that if you had enough zeal, or they called it élan, that you could charge forward and it would be able to overcome a hail of bullets. Well, the machine gun bullets are much more powerful than enthusiasm and zeal in terms of determining what happens to human bodies.
If details of each country's battle plans were secret, the build-up to war was plain for the world to see. And while Germany terrified much of Europe, Russia terrified Germany.
What made it such a formidable threat in the eyes of the Germans was the enormous size of the Russian army. It was by a wide margin the largest army in Europe. Its military planners were confident that by the very momentum of their forces that they could, as they said, like a Russian steamroller, overrun the positions of their antagonists.
There was, among all of the military staffs in 1914, the belief that the best defense is a good offense.
Early that year, Germany's top general, Helmut von Moltke, took a giant step further. He began to argue that Germany should strike first.
We must wage a preventive war, as long as we still have a reasonable chance in this struggle.
That spring, Colonel Edward House, advisor to American President Woodrow Wilson, reported back from Europe.
The situation is extraordinary. It is militarism run stark mad. It only needs a spark to set the whole thing off.
The spark was lit in late June as royalty and commoners alike headed off for their summer vacations. While most Europeans played in the sun, the crisis began in a remote region called the Balkans.
You had new nations in the Balkans. They had just emerged from a long period of rule by the Turkish Empire. Now they had their independence, countries like Bulgaria and Romania and Serbia, and they wanted to expand. And if they expanded, it would be at somebody else's expense, and the question is who the other person would be.
Serbia was the most ambitious, and its neighbor, Austria-Hungary, with its restless mix of nationalities, was an obvious target. The plot hatched by a secret terrorist group called the Black Hand would yield results beyond its planners' wildest dreams. On the morning of June 28, 1914, 7 young Serb terrorists took to the streets of Sarajevo, capital of a province Austria controlled and Serbia wanted. They joined the gathering crowd waiting to see Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austrian throne, in Sarajevo for a rare visit. Assassination was a constant threat, but the Archduke chose to appear without military escort, confident in his subjects' loyalty. At 9:30 in the morning, he and his wife Sophie stepped into an open car, and the procession began. The assassins, inexperienced and nervous, bungled one chance after another. The parade was nearing its end when the Archduke's driver stopped at a crossroads, confused. By sheer coincidence, the terrorist ringleader stood only 5 feet away. Franz Ferdinand and Sophie died within minutes. World War I had just claimed its first victims. The shocking double murder demanded a response. Austria, with its imperial honor and very existence threatened, drew up an ultimatum so insulting that the Serbs would have to reject it, giving Austria an excuse to declare war.
They didn't want a negotiation. They didn't even want an agreement by Serbia to accept Austria's terms. What they really wanted was that Serbia should be wiped off the map.
On July 23rd, Austria sent the ultimatum to Serbia, giving it 48 hours to respond. The clock toward total war started ticking. Germany's Kaiser Wilhelm, who'd promised to support Austria, began to panic as a real war loomed. When Serbia unexpectedly accepted most of Austria's ultimatum, Wilhelm announced with relief a brilliant diplomatic triumph, no excuse for war, no need to mobilize. He was wrong. On July 25th, Austrian Emperor Franz Joseph, urged on by his ministers and generals, signed mobilization orders. The Kaiser tried to persuade Austria to slow down, but behind his back, his own General Moltke sent a secret telegram to Vienna, promising that Germany would mobilize no matter what. The Austrians began to wonder who was in charge in Germany.
The question of who rules in Berlin could be answered in any number of ways, but one way that it could not be answered was the Kaiser. For the ministers who ruled under Wilhelm, it was a question of managing him. And they succeeded in marginalizing the voice of the Kaiser during the final critical days.
The European world in the last week of July 1914 was in a perfect position for the German generals to start a war. If they waited, they'd probably never, ever, ever find such a favorable time.
On July 28th, exactly 1 month after Archduke Franz Ferdinand's assassination, Austria-Hungary declared war against Serbia. It was supposed to be a local war, quick and decisive. But Russia's Tsar Nicholas made a decision that set the Triple Entente and the Triple Alliance on a collision course. To help his fellow Slavs, the Serbs, he ordered a general mobilization.
The Austrians wanted to go to war, and the Germans agreed to support them. What converted the whole thing into a monumental war was the Russian decision, which was probably unnecessary, to go to general mobilization on July the 30th. Once the Russians begin to mobilize, it's almost impossible to put things back into the bottle.
The Tsar's decision came in the midst of 10 desperate telegrams he exchanged with his cousin, Kaiser Wilhelm, each ruler justifying his own decisions while pleading with the other to halt the rush toward war. But the messages overlapped, and by the time each telegram arrived, a new crisis had already begun.
The absence of information is one of the most striking characteristics about warfare. But in this particular case, it's really striking because here were the people at the top who really didn't know actually what had taken place.
As events began to outpace information, three rulers who supposedly had the final say, Tsar Nicholas, Emperor Franz Joseph, and Kaiser Wilhelm, bowed to their generals, who were not thinking how to prevent war, but only how to win, and that meant mobilizing and attacking first.
Mobilization was an enormous military challenge. Once the mobilization began, it would set in motion a kind of automatic mechanism that could not be stopped without creating administrative chaos. Thus, certainly in the German case, the assumption was that the moment mobilization was declared, war was going to be fought.
Germany, hemmed in by enemies, knew it had to fight on two fronts. Its only chance of winning was to first attack and quickly defeat France on the Western Front, then march east and invade Russia before the huge Russian army was ready. But the invasion route from Berlin to Paris sliced through neutral Belgium in violation of the long-ago 1839 treaty. On August 2nd, Germany sent Belgium an ultimatum demanding the right to pass through or be invaded. The next day, August 3rd, Belgium's King Albert rejected the ultimatum. The invasion was on. Belgium, with its neutrality shattered, appealed for support. Britain immediately declared war on Germany, bringing all three members of the Entente into play. The German chancellor was shocked when he heard the news.
All for just a word, neutrality. Just for a scrap of paper.
In contrast to the fear in government chambers, people on the streets reacted with growing excitement.
Even the socialists, the left-wing political groupings, sort of fell into line, particularly as each of the countries could argue they were doing it for defensive purposes. The Germans could say the Russians attacked us, the Austrians could say the Serbs attacked us, the French could say the Germans attacked us, and the British could say, look at what the Germans are doing to our friends.
Whatever reasons people gave at the time, World War I was not necessary nor inevitable, and there was no one cause. Alliances, the arms race, lack of information, national pride, and above all, the horribly false assumption that the war could be controlled, all helped start what some have called the greatest mistake in modern history. Within days, 6 million men across Europe had received marching orders. Kaiser Wilhelm promised his troops they would be home before the leaves fell in autumn. Over 300,000 French soldiers died the first month. 1 million German soldiers were killed in 1914 alone. By year's end, so many men were dead that all armies began calling up their reserves. The war would last 4 senseless, grinding, murderous years. The Great War resolved nothing. It changed everything. The monarchies of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Russia were swept away. Communists seized and transformed Russia. Britain's global navy and its empire disappeared. And Germany, blamed for the war and saddled with crippling war debt, rose again, twisted, vengeful, and ferocious, and launched a worldwide firestorm. When the catastrophe that began in the summer of 1914 finally ended, people called it the war to end all wars. Instead, it became the violent baptism for a bloody, brutal, and war-filled century.